The following is a presentation of the ILR School at Cornell University. ILR, advancing the world of work.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today at ILR's school. We are here to talk about the psychological impact of layoffs on workers and also the implications for organizations. And with us today is Assistant Professor Paul Davis, who's done some deep research on this issue and has a lot to share with us. And some of you, our viewers, have also sent in your questions and will continue to receive your questions. We may not be able to get to all of them today, but Professor Davis has been kind enough to offer to email people individually. So please know that if we don't address your questions directly, that you will receive some kind of message that will let you know what's going on here with Professor Davis and his research involving your question. So let's get started now. Some of the questions that came in overnight have been incorporated into your talk today, Paul, so please get us started.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be talking about what is often a somber and emotional topic, but this is certainly a deep topic. There's a lot that we can talk about here. And initially, I think the intent for this webcast was to have me go deep into some of the research that I've been involved in recently, right? I've been working with colleagues, I should say right up at the front, working with colleagues at the University of Madison at Wisconsin and University of Wisconsin at Madison, and at Rutgers University in New Jersey to try and understand what the impacts of layoffs are on important work behaviors and on voluntary turnover or quitting specifically. And I do want to talk about this research and go into some depth on this research. But as we received questions over the last couple weeks, and I've been looking at them, I've seen an interest more generally in layoffs. Quite a few questions surrounding my research, but also quite a few interested in the sort of broader impacts of layoffs on not only individuals but organizations. And so I think it's worthwhile to spend some time and broaden this discussion a little bit. Hopefully it will make for a more engaging discussion. I want to begin today first by just clarifying something, what exactly I mean when I'm talking about layoffs. In casual conversation, many of us, myself included, I think are guilty of sometimes conflating layoffs with dismissals for cause, what we might call terminations or firings. I think it's important just to be clear about what it is we mean when we say layoffs. So in this case, in the academic sense, when we say layoffs, when we use this term, we're talking about a reduction in headcount. And this is an action where typically we're not looking to replace these employees, at least not in the short term. So we have this planned workforce reduction, or a reduction in jobs. And what's really the distinguishing factor here is that layoffs are motivated by a business level concern, right? We're concerned about some aspect of the business, and typically we're talking about costs here, right? Layoffs, whether or not we believe they do this effectively, are meant to, often initiated to, curtail costs, right? Increasingly, in this economy, we can look at service firms, knowledge-based firms, us, workers, we represent the largest fixed costs, and so we've become something of a target. But with that out of the way, what I want to do is actually set a little context before we move into, first I want to talk about sort of broadly the consequences of layoffs, and then I'll talk a little bit about my research specifically and what I've been up to. But before we do that, I think it's helpful to have a little context and just talk about what it is organizations are doing, what layoffs look like currently, and how that's changed over time. So very briefly, I've somewhat crudely split up the last 70 years or so into these two periods. Post-World War II to the 1980s, roughly the 1980s, and then the 1980s to present. And we can really make a distinction between how layoffs looked between these two periods. So in the earlier period, what we're seeing is, I defined layoffs earlier as a response to a business level concern, a concern about the business. Layoffs are being initiated in this earlier period for reasons of survival, most often, right? Firms are financially distressed. They are concerned about solvency. Layoffs are a reactionary measure here, and typically they're affecting production workers, manufacturing industry. Layoffs are done on the basis of seniority, and often workers are being recalled, right? These are not permanent separations. Things start to change when we move into, roughly around the 80s, and certainly coming to a head when we get to the 1990s. This is an era of delayering, the lean and mean organization, right? Many euphemisms being thrown around, and we see layoffs expand from the production floors, into the office buildings, affecting the professionals, the white-collar workers. And a labor historian, of which we have many here at ILR, they could wax much more poetically and eloquently than I could about the rationale or the reasons for this. But we can point to a few. Right? We know that industries are being deregulated. Airline industry, banking industry, competition is increasing. We know that we're gaining access to lower cost labor markets. Technology is displacing employees, and compensation, which is another area of interest of mine. We have executives. Their pay is starting to be more closely tied to the firm, the financials of the firm, right? At one point, our top executives are paid these set salaries, whereas today, the majority of this compensation is in the form of stock options, stock awards. So all of these factors are contributing to what I would call a move, not fully away from this reactionary take on layoffs, but it is becoming more proactive. Organizations that are otherwise seemingly healthy are starting to see layoffs as a viable strategy to maintain their position, to maintain profitability and growth. So we see layoffs expand to really affect all of us. I mean, there's very few jobs these days where we are not vulnerable to this threat. One of the questions that I received, I think, fits in nicely here. It was asking about who's most vulnerable, and this question was specifically wondering about older workers. Might older workers be more vulnerable to layoffs than others? And referencing issues such as, they may have a higher salary if they've been, longer tenured. They may have health issues that make them a target. We can acknowledge the fact that there are protections, right? Not just for older workers, but for many worker groups with protections based on race, sex, religion, disability status. But the unfortunate reality is that we do find some support for this idea that these groups are more vulnerable to layoffs whenever an organization has decided to take that action. And it's not any health issue per se, and I don't think that it's necessarily a higher cost issue. What academics typically point to is the fact that minority groups within organization, and whether that minority status is based on age or race or disability status or what have you, these individuals tend to have the deck stacked against them in a way. There's often negative stereotypes projected onto minority groups, and often they have lower power within organizations. And so these factors can make them more vulnerable and vulnerable to discrimination in this case. What we do find is that this is not the primary determining factor for layoffs, right? It is there, but more often than not, organizations are looking to past performance, seniority, skill set, attitudes such as organizational commitment. these tend to be better predictors of who is most vulnerable to layoffs. What I want to talk about now is, what do we know about the consequences of layoffs, both at the firm level and for survivors and victims. And layoffs have been and continue to be such a traumatic experience that even in the academic literature, we've adopted this terminology to describe the people affected as survivors and victims. Right? Survivors are the people who remain with the organization, and the victims are those who ultimately are separated. What is interesting, if we take a look at firm performance, and here we're talking firm financial performance, we might expect layoffs to have a beneficial influence on firm financial performance, in part because they're so prevalent. Tens of millions of layoffs occur in the United States over a period of about 10 years. We're counting in the tens of millions over that time period. If we look at just the most recent recession, upwards of 15 million jobs lost through layoffs. So these are very common, and there's this intuitive argument that if layoffs were detrimental to firm performance, the power brokers within organizations, the executives, the owners who have a financial stake in the continued health of the organization, well, they would have abandoned layoffs if they were not effective, right? Because their fortunes are tied up in the fortunes of the company. So the fact that we see layoffs continue to proliferate suggests that, hey, maybe these are beneficial to the organization. What is interesting is that the academic research does not bear that out. At best, we're finding inconclusive results, and I would characterize the literature as kind of swinging more in the direction that layoffs have detrimental effects, null to detrimental effects. And so we should be asking ourselves, well, what's going on here? Why is there this disconnect between practice and what academics know or what we think we know? And I think we can point to a few different factors. I would talk to the conception of layoffs, how layoffs are conceived, and also how layoffs are executed. And that can sort of help us move through this slide into talking about outcomes for employees. When I talk about the conception of layoffs, what I'm thinking about here is the degree to which they're tied to the organizational strategy. I think it's actually somewhat rare that organizations, when they pursue layoff action, that they are taking due diligence to think about what it is the organization is trying to accomplish in the short term, near term, long term, and how the workforce will play into that. If a layoff is to be successful, and again, I'm talking from a financial performance standpoint here, we really do need to be thinking about what the workforce needs to look like, again, in the short, near, and long term. And I think too often there's a focus on economics and costs and this sort of short term, where can we try and cut costs and bolster performance immediately. So that's one part of the problem. The second issue that may explain some of these negative findings is that layoffs are tricky to carry out, extremely tricky and extremely emotionally charged. There's a well-documented phenomenon known as survivor syndrome. So we're talking about the level of implementation here. We know that individuals who they're not targeted for layoff, but they witness it, they go through it, their colleagues and friends are the ones who are subjected to it, they're typically not better off, right, for the experience. They can harbor ill will towards the organization if they perceive that their colleagues have been mistreated. They worry that it's going to happen to them next. Frequently, they're saddled with additional workload, right? We've lost people, but we still have the same amount of work that we did yesterday. So burnout is an issue. The best people, the people we'd like to stick around, they actually have options, right? Even in a down economy, the highest performers, the ones with the most valuable skill sets, they still have mobility. And we do see after a layoff a bit of an exodus of the people that organizations actually wanted to keep around. Voluntary turnover increases, quits increase. So this is a process that's really fraught with danger, again, coming from that sort of organizational performance perspective. So I think for those reasons, this is why we're seeing these mixed effects. And I think there is a very real argument that layoffs are, let's just say, difficult at best in terms of achieving these financial outcomes that we may be after. The last group that I want to talk about here is victims, because this really leads us into the research that I've been conducting. So in the existing literature, what we know about those individuals who are targeted for layoff victims, we really know little about what happens to them when they become reemployed, but we do know that, as I've mentioned before, this is a very traumatic experience. Psychological effects, it's emotionally difficult, there's financial distress, there's shame that comes along with this. Attitudes towards work become negative. It is very much a traumatic experience. And so, not a very rosy picture overall, I would say. And that is not to argue that there is no place for layoffs. I think certainly, again, thinking about the long-term solvency of the firm, the accomplishment of strategic objectives, layoffs can play a part in that. But increasingly, I think we need to recognize that this is perhaps not the first strategy we want to be pursuing. Before we move into my work, there was one other question I wanted to address, and it asked about when an employer is considering layoffs, what exactly should they be looking at when deciding who actually will be staying and who will be going? So this question asked, should we be thinking about whether the individual has been laid off before, whether he or she, what their family situation is like, or are we only thinking about performance and economics? And I think this is a good spot to address this question because it really ties into what I've been talking about. I wouldn't go so far as to select one specific factor and say this is the best practice. I think we have to speak more generally about this issue and recognize again that we want to be thinking about the organizational strategy. What is it that we are trying to accomplish with this layoff, and the criteria that we are going to make those decisions based upon, that should emanate from sort of this broader initiative that we're trying to achieve, these broader goals. What I will say, if we again talk about at the implementation level, is what we want to do is choose criteria that are as objective as possible and that are as relevant as possible. Right? If the layoff has been motivated by we're looking to move into a new business, or we're looking to create new technology or make use of new technology, and we need a new skill set, then skills might be the deciding factor that we want to base that layoff on. Seniority may be perceived by the employees as really an unfair way to decide that layoff in this case. So we want to be cognizant that we're doing things in a very objective and as fair as possible in order to minimize the distress that layoffs can often cause. So I want to pivot now to my research. So I mentioned earlier that we really don't have much in the way of academic research, quantitative research that investigates how layoffs are affecting the types of employees that we become. And this is important research because, again, it is affecting so many of us. And so this research was intended to address that. It's an initial step, And we chose here to focus on quits. We know quits are expensive. We know organizations pay close attention to this issue. So we thought this was a good starting point. What we did here, the data that we ended up utilizing for this study, we went for career data. We wanted to know everything about the individuals that we were studying from a work history standpoint. And we wanted to do this so that we could isolate exactly when layoffs occurred. We didn't want to miss any layoffs because we think a layoff is probably powerfully related to this outcome that we're interested in. So we wanted to be able to identify all the quits, all the layoffs, and not only because we didn't want to miss anything, because we wanted to be able to capture this effect, but also because it turns out that a very powerful approach for answering this question is to be able to compare someone's quits before having been laid off to their quits after having been laid off. So that's how we actually estimated the magnitude of the impact of layoffs on quits, comparing quits before to quits after. And this turns out to be a very powerful statistical methodological approach. But it's actually very difficult to find this type of data because we're talking about decades and decades of work history. We're very fortunate to find that the U.S. government, through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, has been collecting this type of data. Since 1978, they've been following this cohort of around 13,000 people. They came of age in the early 80s, right when layoffs, the use of layoffs started to change. And they've been following them every year since. I guess most recently they've been surveyed every other year. But we have this longitudinal account of these people's work history, and it really is ideal for answering this type of question. So we, from this initial sample of 13,000, we pulled out around 2,500 individuals who had experienced a layoff. And here I'm talking about a reduction in force layoff where some individuals at their work site were affected, but others were not. Roughly 14,000 jobs, a little more than that, that we were able to study here. And this sample was ideal in a lot of ways because it is so broad. When it was constructed initially, it was meant to provide us with a snapshot of individuals about this age. So it was supposed to represent the broader country, right? We have representation from all over the country, sort of geography-wise. We have representation from all industries, occupations, socioeconomic statuses. So we can say with some confidence that what we find here is what's going on in the broader American population.
Paul, could I intersect with a couple of questions?
Yeah,
We're getting
sure,
some
sure.
excellent questions in, and I'd like to remind everyone to please include your email if you would. That way we can get back to you with those that we won't have time to address. But one here I think is applicable to some of what you've just shared, and that is, this is from Jeff. Does the type of industry or public-private sector impact workers' behaviors?
Following a layoff.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question, and it's actually where I was headed with before you stopped me, which is great. I think you should do, otherwise I will drone on. A drawback of the data that we examined here was that because it was so broad and because we were pulling out only those individuals who had been laid off, we were left with numbers that were a little small to dive deep into specific industries, specific occupations. And so we weren't able, and we're not able, to speak with much specificity about particular groups that we might be interested in. And that's kind of the trade-off that we made, to be able to talk about something that generalizes to our country. At the same time, we're missing the trees for some extent for the forest. The public versus private issue, so that's a question that I've seen from a few people regarding, well, actually, no, that's separate. And let me think. This is something that we haven't we haven't examined either. I think we could. I think we could in this data, but it's not something that we did with this study. We had, unfortunately, only so much space, and what's being reported here, we've actually eliminated public sector jobs, and we focused on private sector jobs. And without getting sort of too deep in the weeds, the rationale there was that we wanted to focus on a subset of the broader labor market that we thought would, where the psychological explanation, this idea of psychological spillover, where we thought that would be most likely to manifest, because we were really interested in whether or not that existed. And so that's why we chose to focus here on the private sector. But I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea of psychological spillover, because I think that if we understand that, we can start to apply it to some of these more specific employee groups that we might be interested in.
And if we could possibly start that segment
Yeah.
With a question which I think is really interesting, which might fit into what you've done.
Okay.
It might not, but it's a very interesting question. And it's, how can management get in front of the message to prepare its workforce for or do damage control after a layoff? How should that message be delivered?
Yeah, so I think you want to get in front of it, right? You want to be proactive with this. And this is not easy, right? This is not an easy issue. And so I don't want to, sit here and sort of wax on about, here's exactly what you should do and you should be doing this, when the realities of the business world make some of this very difficult. That being said, I think we do need to think about layoffs more as a last resort. And I think that anything we can do along the way, if we are hurtling toward that outcome, anything we can do along the way to prepare employees for that, to discuss with them what's going on in the broader economy and how our organization fits into it, how we are doing. I would encourage leadership within organizations to consider alternatives. And there are many, and they're not easy. But we have programs, we have work sharing, we have furloughs, we have pay cuts, we have buyouts. Some of these are in use, and some of them are much less common. And that's a way to, as we're talking about the direction that the economy and the company's going, we can be pursuing these alternatives to try and stave off that layoff. Another thing that I think is really helpful is to engage employees in this process of, what are we going to do to avoid the possibility of layoffs? Our employees are incredibly smart. They know the business, they know the industry, and they're incredibly creative. I think that organizations that have put the challenge to their employees to bring them on as partners, they do have some success in avoiding a layoff, or when it ultimately comes down to it, and that action is decided that it must be taken, it does reduce, right, some of the damage that it can do.
Mm-hmm. And worst case scenario, and this comes in from Amy, what is key for survivors to hear?
Well, worst case scenario, what is key for survivors to hear? I don't think it's any one specific thing. I think it's being open and honest with them. I think it's explaining to them why the action was taken, explaining to them why they have been retained within the organization, what their place is in the organization, and why they are going to be critical for the success of the organization. Right? They're the ones who are going to help pull us through. I think that's what they need to hear. I think that, you can imagine, and I'm sure many of you have witnessed this. There's a lot of fear, a lot of suspicion, a lot of, am I next, following a layoff? And so I think you want to make very clear what the plan is and how they fit into it.
Okay. Next steps in your research. Any thoughts there?
Well, if you don't mind, let me
Sure.
talk a little bit more about what we did, describe the results, and talk about this issue of spillover, because I do think, it's getting a little into the academies, I guess, by talking about this idea of psychological spillover. But I think it does help us. I think it gives, if we understand why we're seeing this effect of layoffs on quits, like I said, we can start to apply it to groups we're interested in. We can start to think more, with more depth about the implications of this. So what we did find when we studied this group was that yes, layoffs make us more likely to quit. And the effect is actually relatively large. In that next job after a layoff, individuals are 65% more likely to quit that job relative to how likely they were to quit in that pre-layoff period. And when we collapse all the post-layoff jobs together, we're finding that it seems like the effect may persist. This consequence may persist, into the second and third and fourth job, because we're still seeing this 56% greater likelihood. And, to some extent that is buoyed by individuals who are hit again and again by layoffs, but still there is some argument for this persistence of effect. So what we wanted to do in this study is not just document this, but to understand why it's happening. Why is it that a layoff that happens to me in one context, one employer has initiated this action, why does that affect how I relate to another employer? And this is where this idea of spillover comes in. We theorize that layoffs have psychological consequences. I don't think that would surprise anyone, that they have psychological consequences for their victims. What we theorize is that these consequences follow us from job to job. They spill over. And so I have two consequences here that roll up into this idea of spillover. And the first is we see a reduction in terms of really commitment is how we can think about it, this idea of weaker ties to subsequent employers. And so what's going on here? Well, we see layoffs. After a layoff, individuals, workers, we come to actually expect less from subsequent employers, right? And actually what we're talking about here is that they come to expect less in terms of job security, which may sound, some of you may be skeptical to hear this, right? Because the message that we're often hearing these days is, well, there is no such thing as job security. Job security is dead. And how can something that doesn't exist, how can it be negatively affected by a layoff? But what these data indicate, and I've actually been able to replicate these findings with a younger cohort, with a cohort that began work right around the year 2000. What we're finding is that layoffs very much do affect them and are affecting their perceptions of job security. If they are hearing this message and taking it in, I think that we believe it might apply to others, but most of us, we show up for our jobs every day. We put in our time, our 8, 9, 10 hours. We work hard. We do the job that we were hired to do and paid to do. And when, despite that, we're on the receiving end of a layoff, it's shocking and it's jarring and it's traumatic, to come back to that word, for a lot of people. We know that the highest performing employee, a model employee, if she doesn't have the skill set that the organization is looking for moving forward, is vulnerable to layoffs. And so I think we do expect still, despite this messaging, that if we show up and do our job and put in effort, that we might be protected from this, and that's simply not the case very often. And so that's what we're seeing here. And what happens in response to this new understanding of job security is that we as workers, we're going to return the favor, right? We're going to provide our employers with less. What is less in this case? It's loyalty and it's commitment. And so this is part of what's driving that effect. The other issue, the other consequence here is an increased vigilance. after having been through this experience, layoffs and the associated unemployment, this is not pleasant. It makes sense that we want to avoid this in the future. So now we're attuned to the external environment. We're looking for maybe a plan B. Plan Bs can quickly become plan As, especially if we're not feeling that loyalty. So this is what we're pointing to as the mechanism through which layoffs are influencing quits. And what I want to do, I'll try to do this very briefly because then I want to address a couple more questions that came in that I think this discussion will really allow us to leap into. With those initial findings, the 65% more likely or 56% more likely, this doesn't tell us whether or not this psychological spillover theory is valid, whether it's actually what's going on. So we went back to the data. We wanted to test this, and we set up 3 tests. The first thing we did was we ruled out alternative explanations. Right after a layoff, victims often move into underemployment. The jobs aren't quite as good. They pay less. We're working part-time maybe when we want to be working full-time. When we accounted for these factors, we found that the effect still persisted. Right? Layoff victims were still much more likely to quit. So spillover passed this test. Then we moved on. We thought, well, if layoffs are eroding our loyalty, and if layoffs are increasing this vigilance, there's a ceiling and a floor there, right? At some point, loyalty has to be 0. At some point, there's only 24 hours in a day. We can't be on constant watch for alternative job opportunities. So we thought that with multiple layoffs, if spillover is correct, eventually an additional layoff should have no effect, right? It should plateau. And that's what we found. We found that the second layoff was less powerful than the first, and the third layoff was even less powerful. And if you can believe it, it took the 6th layoff before subsequent layoffs had no effect. We had individuals in this data set with double digits layoffs in their history. But again, spillover passed this test. And the final thing that we did was look at different types of quits. And we found that layoffs really predispose people to take an unsolicited job offer while they were employed, and predispose people to seek out and take a job offer while they were employed. And both of these we would predict from the spillover perspective, right? Because the decreasing loyalty, the increased vigilance, that's bringing down the barriers that would have otherwise kept employees from taking these paths. On the flip side, we didn't find much of an effect at all when we looked at whether or not individuals were quitting to search for jobs. In fact, layoffs had no effect on this behavior. And to some extent, it makes sense. I mean, vigilance isn't an issue here. So, the spillover is not, from that perspective, not acting on this path. But what we thought was probably going on here was that having just been through a period of unemployment, the financial distress, the kind of negative connotations that we associate with unemployment, we thought layoff victims would probably not be interested in this path. That would be something they'd want to avoid, and that seems to have bared itself out. So we do think that there is some good evidence for this theory of spillover. So why is this important? What can we do with this? I received a couple questions actually asking about unionized settings versus non-unionized settings. Does that matter? And this isn't something that we looked at, but we can apply spillover to think through this problem. If I'm laid off and I'm covered under a collective bargaining agreement, what's spillover going to look like? Is it going to look the same as if I'm working and not covered under a CBA and laid off? And what I would argue is that layoffs from these unionized jobs, unionized facilities, spillover is likely less. Maybe vigilance, maybe we're a little more vigilant. We've still gone through the pain and the unpleasantness of the layoff, and so we're a little more likely to look around and see what else is out there. But on the loyalty side, I think there's a good argument that, within that unionized setting, we really know what our job security is, right? It's often spelled out in the collective bargaining agreement. Layoffs are often conducted by seniority. We know that if we were the last in, we're most likely going to be the first out. So there really isn't the same opportunity to erode loyalty in the way that it would occur absent that collective bargaining agreement. And because this was a question that we received in advance, I was able to take a look at this. Last couple days I went into the data and looked at the difference between being laid off from one of these from a unionized setting versus a non-unionized setting. And sure enough, when we are laid off from a unionized setting, we're still more likely to quit, but less so than had we been laid off from a non-unionized job, non-union organization. So again, we see evidence for spillover. So I think that's really interesting, and I'm glad someone asked that. I think it's a really important question. Another question that came in that was not able to take a look at in the data, but I think it is a great one to think about, and we can probably apply spillover again to this question, is workers with disabilities. Does this effect show up there as well? And I'm not a disability researcher. That's not an area of expertise. So I'm somewhat hesitant to apply the spillover logic and make a prediction here. But what I will say is that I have had conversations around the ILR school with our experts in this field, the Yang Tan Institute, our Institute for Disability Studies. And actually, much before we had even scheduled this webcast, we've been talking about looking at this issue. But we've actually been somewhat less interested in voluntary turnover. I mean, I would love to study that again for this very specific population. But I think in our conversations, what struck me was, what we were worried about was whether there might be a discouraged worker effect here, that workers with disabilities, if they've been through this layoff experience, are they more likely to withdraw completely from the labor force, and give up unemployment? And I think that's an extremely important question, and one that I'm hopeful that we can address.
Here's one just on Paul that is applicable to many of the items you've discussed, and this is from Vlad. Were there any differences in the probability of quit based on level of education, age, or any other characteristics?
Most likely, yes. So this was a study that was published a couple years ago now, and there was a great table in that article with estimates for many of the characteristics that you're asking about here: age, education level, marital status, number of children. Do I have them off the top of my head? Unfortunately, no. I'm sorry.
No problem. Another sort of general question is from an anonymous viewer, and I would encourage people to use their emails when you send to us so we can follow up with you. It says, you mentioned loyalty, but why is that important to the company? What does loyalty look like, feel like, sound like?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think that loyalty, different companies will value loyalty at different levels. There are a number of very successful organizations out there that their approach to their employees, their approach to labor is more of a commodity, and they're not so interested in treating employees as partners and thinking about creating a partnership and fostering some of these attitudes that we like to talk about as being very beneficial. So this isn't perhaps universal. What I will say is that the reason we chose to start here, if to the extent that loyalty translates to voluntary turnover, this is a potentially very expensive problem for organizations, right? When we do value tenure within the organization, we want to, if we're going to spend a lot of money training people and the longer, if there's a correlation between their time in the organization and the value that they can provide to it, this is something that we really do want to be thinking about. Even in organizations where it is that sort of more transactional approach to the employment relationship, even in those cases, voluntary turnover it can be an extremely expensive outcome, anywhere from 50% of the annual salary up to 2 times or more. So I think it really is an issue that organizations are concerned with.
Mm-hmm. Back to layoff consequences and implications. This is a question from one of our ILR alums, Stephen Birkenfeld. He says, do the reasons for the layoffs matter? More specifically, are the consequences worse when it is what I call a productivity layoff, where a company can just do more with fewer people, mostly from the adoption of technology, as opposed to layoffs based on some stress or distress at a company or a restructuring of the company's business?
So are the outcomes worse in terms of financial performance or in terms of voluntary turnover? I guess the answer could change depending on which direction we go there. I think that it's possible. I'm not aware of research that investigates that, although I think there should be, because it's a really great question. Whether or not, what exactly the business level concern was, whether or not that sort of manifests in terms of these people level outcomes. What I will say is that I can imagine that yes, there would be differences there. Unfortunately, I can't point to them, but I think that regardless of the reason for the layoff, the implementation is still critically important, right? We still want to be thinking about how to do this in an objective and just way, objectively and fairly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. This one is kind of a disturbing question, but one that I think is certainly worth airing. What have you found regarding the attitudes of giving up, seeking future employment, and hopelessness in pursuing career goals among varied ages and stages of the career cycle?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I might move ahead one slide as I try to answer that and unpack that somewhat. So what I will say with regards to the research that I just presented here, the research that I've done, is that we completely missed out on those individuals who may have gone through a layoff and withdrawn from the labor force, right? If they have decided, that's it, the system's rigged against me, this isn't for me, I'm done. We actually lose that effect. And so the sort of negative implications, if we want to think of it that way, of layoffs here, we're actually missing potentially an important piece of this. And I think it is a real concern, right? You can imagine someone who's just been repeatedly hit with a layoff, just eventually, thrown in the towel. The reason I wanted to advance the slides a little more was because I wanted to talk about, I had a couple implications that I wanted to discuss, but your question feeds into that really well. So one of the concerns that I hear from organizational leaders, when they get a hold of this research, is, they'll say, well, I guess this means that we don't want to hire layoff victims if they're more likely to quit, given that I've just discussed how expensive it is. And I think that is a little short-sighted in terms of A, feasibility, but B, effectiveness. And so you're asking about career objectives and motivation. I think I was hearing motivation to perform. Some research that I'm actually currently engaged in, we are looking at job performance following a layoff. So we want to explore other important behaviors. And I think job performance is arguably the more important when we pair it against voluntary turnover. And interestingly, what we're finding is that job performance actually increases following a layoff. It seems that people are actually more motivated to perform. And if we wanted to roll that up under the psychological spillover banner, I think what we're looking at is a third mechanism here, where we realize that yes, we are all at risk for layoffs, but all else being equal, very often layoffs are decided at the individual level. They're decided upon looking at performance data or looking at skill data. So individuals, I think, are being motivated to put more in, right, and to develop their skills. And so I think when we think about what these findings mean for us as organizations, we need to look at the broader picture and consider certainly other behaviors such as performance. On the feasibility side, the reason I would question the feasibility of really trying to avoid hiring layoff victims into the organization is it's going to be very difficult to I think ascertain that. We're talking about all of our job applicants trying to find out who has a layoff in their history and who doesn't. But perhaps more importantly, to do so would be to exclude an increasingly large proportion of the broader labor pool, right? Especially in certain industries where layoffs have been more common. We'd be excluding people with, really good experience, really valuable experience that we may otherwise want to bring into the organization, especially if they're going to be motivated to perform when they get there. And I would add, especially if we can do something to reestablish, that trust, to rebuild those relationships. In organizations where we are trying to partner with our employees, we weren't able to look at what levers are available to organizational leadership to try and change this effect. But they're absolutely, I'm certain that they're there, and we need future study to look at this. But it's going to come down to practices that establish openness of communication. We're being honest with people. We are helping to develop them. We're showing them that they're valued in the organization. I think there's a real opportunity for organizations that are willing to pursue these avenues to really turn this around.
Mm-hmm. And some of these industries are going away, and that's why people get laid off, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe government and others can be thinking ahead as to, where to siphon those laid off workers. Brian writes in, have you found differences in the psychological spillover when the laid off workers don't have an expectation of returning to the industry they were laid off from? Which begs the question.
Yeah. I haven't been able to look at that, but that is a great question, right? So this is somewhat anecdotally, right? But I have heard from, it's very anecdotally, very much an anecdote. But I have heard from some people who have been through a layoff, who said, actually this was really good for me because it really shifted the way that I think about my work life. Before I was pursuing this career and some of these very tangible rewards, what our compensation is, pursuing the promotions, that sort of thing, that it turned out that wasn't actually all that important to me. And this layoff has kind of shifted me out of that mentality to pursue something that I'm a little more passionate about. And so you could imagine someone who is making that shift actually being much more committed to what they're doing now, and much more committed to that industry, that occupation. Absolutely.
Okay. Is there a slide you'd like to close us out with?
Well, this is my last slide, so
okay.
We made it.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much to our viewers. You've been a wonderful audience. We received terrific questions, and please use the question feature to give us some feedback. Let us know what we did well. Let us know what we need to work on. Please join us in the future. This link, by the way, is good to go right now. You can share it with your friends and use it yourselves. And thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the ILR School at Cornell University.